Welcome. It's good to see so many friends here. I'm Tracy Fessenden. I'm based at the center. I am really thrilled to be welcoming Kathleen Cummings, who is our speaker for today. Kathleen is someone that I have known for probably more than 2 decades. Oh my goodness. I will not introduce her. Our friend and colleague, Catherine O'Donnell in the history department will tell you more about Kathleen Cummings, but I get to welcome you here to the center. Kathleen's talk is titled Good Apples and Broken Records, Studying U.S. Catholic History Under Spotlight's Glare. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, please turn off your cell phones. And please join us in the lobby for refreshments after the event. The talk today is not being live streamed, but we will make the recording available on our YouTube channel in about a week. So if you'd like to hear it again, you can go there. And I wanted to also let you know that we have another great event coming up this month on February 22nd at 3 o'clock right here. Please join us for a panel discussion titled, What's Religion Got to Do with It? The panelists will include our colleague Anand Gopal, the New Yorker writer, who is also part of our faculty, as well as several other faculty members in the university. The conversation will discuss how religion, conflict, and politics are and are not related in West Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. So what does it mean to call something a religious conflict? And where might we place too much emphasis on religion as a factor in political life? And this is sort of new for us because we always want to remind people how much religion matters for our political life and our conflicts, but sometimes we tend to overemphasize religion. So we want to talk about how and when that happens. We hope that you can join us. If you found our panel on Gaza, on Israel-Gaza meaningful, we hope you'll feel the same about this one as well, and we hope to see you. As always, more information can be found on our website. If you haven't already signed up for our mailing list, please do. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, X, formerly known as Twitter. Today's event is the second in our Religion and Conflict Past and Future lecture series in conjunction with our anniversary, our 20th anniversary last year. This new lecture series explores continuities and new developments in our understanding of religion, conflict, and peace. And you knew I was going to say it. This is all supported by our generous friends. We depend on the generous donations from our community to support our programs, which include student scholarships, fellowships, and research initiatives, as well as public education programs like our lecture today. So thank you all who are friends of the center, and to those of you who have established or renewed your friendship in the last year. I am delighted now to introduce my colleague, Catherine O'Donnell, Professor of History.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you to the Center and to Shippers and to the Humanities Institute. I am delighted to introduce Kathleen Sprows Cummings, who is the Reverend John A. O'Brien Collegiate Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Notre Dame. And she is a scholar who is dedicated to the kind of clear-eyed and compassionate inquiry that I have come to associate with this center. Kathy is a leading scholar of Catholicism as it has developed in the United States. In addition to editing collections that have shaped the field, her 2 monographs, New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholicism in the Progressive Era, and the prize-winning A Saint of Our Own, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American, have given scholars and general readers new ways to think about Catholicism, about women, about faith, about institutions, about the concatenation of claims to national distinctiveness and universal truth. But Kathy's influence is felt not only through works she's written, but also through works that others could not have written without her. She is a tireless steward of the field and its scholars, serving 2 terms as director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism after 2 terms as associate director. Kathy broadened and deepened the scope of inquiry and brought scholars together, brought scholars to archives, and in short has lived out what I think of as the true exhortation of scholars only connect. As director and a scholar, Kathy has in recent years explored the ongoing tragedy, crime, brokenness of clerical sexual abuse, and it is on this subject that she will speak with us today. Her talk is entitled Good Apples and Broken Records, Studying U.S. Catholic History Under Spotlight's Glare.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today. I'm so grateful to Ron Broglio and Victoria Day from the Humanities Institute for co-sponsoring this, Victoria for her coordination of logistics, which was just so professional and so wonderful because I had a little bit of a complicated, I wanted to see the Grand Canyon, which I had never seen. So I came in a day early and saw that. I also want to thank Jason and Tracy from the center, Tracy, an old friend, and Jason, a new friend. Just really delighted to be here to talk about this topic, a topic that is not a delight to talk about. I'd like to thank you all for coming. And I'd like to acknowledge in a particular way all survivors of sexual violence who are present in this audience and who will be listening to the recording later. I admire your courage and acknowledge your pain. And I just want to say that I'm speaking about a woman who, among other things, was a really good listener to survivors. And in that respect, she has taught me a lot. And I try to do my best to listen to sources on clergy sexual abuse and think about what they mean for the study of the American Catholic past. In January of 2002, the Boston Globe Spotlight investigative team propelled clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic Church onto the front pages of American newspapers. Spotlight reporters were not the first to expose this phenomenon. Journalists and survivors had been writing about it since the first credible reports had surfaced in the United States 2 decades before. They eventually published 800 articles on the topic. What Spotlight did do, though, was draw significantly more public attention and, in short order, more scholarly attention to the subject. Historians, by and large, lagged behind theologians, pastoral psychologists, sociologists, criminologists, and legal theorists in embracing clerical sex abuse as a subject of scholarly inquiry. In 2020, religion scholar Brian Kleitz blasted historians of U.S. Catholicism for what he called their deafening disciplinary silence. With one or two exceptions, we had produced no book-length studies devoted to the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. Compounding this silence is the fact that very little has been done to integrate sex abuse into other themes and topics in the history of U.S. Catholicism. There have been a number of historical surveys of of Catholicism published, and it's become a bit of a trend to have the last chapter named something like abuse, suggesting that this is kind of a coda to the story. And from what we're learning, it is anything but a coda. It has been pervasive and present for a long time, and it's time that we started to acknowledge that. I can think of reasons why historians have been comparatively slow to embrace the topic. The scale is simply overwhelming. To just cite the most up-to-date statistics published by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, between 1950 and 2018, over 7,000 clerics abused children, so people under the age of 18. That doesn't include vulnerable adults. This is about 5.9% of priests who were involved in active ministry at this time. So this has been in every diocese. This is pervasive, and it's really hard to know where to begin. And it's terrifying sometimes to know where to begin. I think a second reason why historians have been slow to embrace this is a siloing of subfields. It's possible to say, as I myself did for many years, well, sexuality is not my particular area of interest, so therefore I don't write about this. I joined the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism as its associate director 6 months before the Spotlight investigation began. And as a part of a public-facing center, I learned very early on in my career how to speak to the media about sex abuse. So I got, if not comfortable, at least able to speak to journalists, to contextualize the latest developments, give public commentary. But I didn't consider approaching clergy sex abuse as a historian. I was occupied with many other research projects that I believed didn't really touch on sex abuse. That changed for me in the summer of 2018 with really double revelations. In June of 2018, then Cardinal Theodore McCarrick it was released that he had been a serial abuser of seminarians and that his abuse had been essentially an open secret. That August, the Pennsylvania grand jury report was released. This is August of 2018, which chronicled abuse in 6 adjacent dioceses in the state of Pennsylvania. This was a turning point for me, as it was for many, but this was what convinced me that I was underestimating the extent and the pervasiveness of sex abuse in the Catholic Church. And I came to believe, and I believe even more firmly now, that I could no longer claim to be a credible scholar of U.S. Catholicism, let alone a director of a Center for the Study of American Catholicism, without acquiring at least a reasonable amount of familiarity with, if not outright expertise on, the subject. So I founded a project at the Cushwa Center that was called Gender, Sex, and Power. And it involved a partnership with bishopaccountability.org. And I just want to thank publicly Terry McKiernan, who's the founder of bishopaccountability.org, which is a massive archives that is committed to transparency and to collecting sources. There are about 80,000 pages online that are available. Participants in our working group, we had a working group of 15 people, had access to over 250,000 pages of documents, all of which had been, many of which had been released by, as part of the legal process or in various other ways. This is just a small fraction of what is available on Bishop Accountability. So if you are interested in finding out more about it, this is an excellent place to start. Well, I mean, there's Pope Benedict, right? I mean, so, yeah. But here, this is just the landing page for Bishop Accountability. So you can see someone holding a survivor holding a picture of her making her first communion.
People across the top, all men.
Oh, yeah. No, they're all bad guys. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, yeah. I just wanted to put this up here so you would have it's linked and a place to go. And what I'll be speaking about today is how I utilize documents that are many of which are available on bishopaccountability.org, but of course there are supplementary archives that I used as a place to begin, because it can be hard to know where to begin. Once you develop even a glancing familiarity with these sources, it forces us to rethink other sources. And so what I'm going to do today is to bring some of the sources on sex abuse into conversation with other sources and explain how that shaped my own research, is shaping my research, and then suggest other ways it could really help us revisit familiar texts and rethink interpretations of the American Catholic past. A colleague of mine, Catherine Osborne, framed the question this way: when the spotlight was turned on sexual abuse, what else did the light from its edges illuminate? It's a great metaphor. For me, I do a lot of writing about American Catholic sisters, members of religious communities. And I want to introduce the one who I'm focused on today. Her name is Catherine Mulkerrin. She is the eponymous good apple and broken record of my subtitle. She dubbed herself a broken record. I call her a good apple, and whether you agree with that or not, we can talk about that. Mulkerrin was a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Boston, I'll call them the CSJs for short, who spent 2 years enmeshed in the story later revealed by Spotlight. She is not an obvious first choice for a protagonist in a historical study of sex abuse. She was not an abuser, neither was she a bishop involved in its cover-up. But she provides, I think, a uniquely panoramic view of clerical sex abuse in Boston and beyond. Despite her brief time in the Boston Chancery, she was there between 1992 and 1994, Mulkerrin's fingerprints are all over the Spotlight expose, quite literally so in her meticulous memos, which detail the facts that were revealed to her by survivors, as well as the ones she uncovered herself, relying on a combination of privileged access and dogged persistence. Mulkerrin is also useful as a protagonist because she was a reasonably sympathetic, although certainly not blameless, figure in the scandal. Priest perpetrators may offer a logical place to begin historical research on the abuse crisis, but I believe it's impossible to comprehend fully what prompted and perpetuated the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church without substantially widening the cast of historical actors. An exclusive or even an outside focus on the abusers not only risks minimizing the full impact of the crisis on U.S. Catholicism, but goes against the grain of scholarship in other disciplines, which has moved beyond a focus on perpetrators to an analysis of the broader patterns that enabled and sheltered them. This expansive approach undermines the bad apples theory, which church leaders have long invoked, either to absolve themselves of blame or, after implementing safeguards such as the Dallas Charter for the Protection of Minors, the USCCB adopted in 2002, to declare the crisis over. According to this line of thinking, clerical sexual abuse resulted from the sins of a few depraved priests who constitute a small percentage of the total and for whom the entire church cannot be held responsible. We see this again and again from church leaders, including Pope Francis, who says things like this very often. This explanation controverts mounting evidence that points to systemic failures rather than individual crimes as the prime movers in the crisis. In their 2022 study, theologians Julie Hanlon-Rubio and Paul J. Schultz concluded that clergy sexual abuse cannot be attributed to some bad apples and must be analyzed in relationship to the whole ecclesial life. Now, there's evidence to suggest Mulkerrin was one of those good apples. The Attorney General from the state of Massachusetts publicized a damning report in which he singled out Mulkerrin as a fierce and lonely advocate for change. The attorneys who deposed her acknowledged what she had tried to do. And most of all, as I alluded to at the beginning, it's clear she was a sympathetic and compassionate listener to hundreds of survivors of abuse at the hands of Boston priests. And I think Mulkerrin's experience makes clear that the good apples can be as revelatory as the rotten ones when it comes to understanding how the Catholic sexual abuse crisis unfolded and the historical assumptions it calls into question. Focusing on Mulkerrin also lends itself to an exploration of an aspect of the crisis not yet plumbed in any depth. And that is the role of Catholic gender hierarchies played in accentuating the clergy sex abuse scandal in the United States. The assumption that God created women to be subservient to the men in their lives, fathers, husbands, priests, bishops, or religious superiors, was without question one trigger of the cascading institutional failures that enabled and protected abusers. Consider, for example, one telling nugget from the mammoth report the Vatican published on the career of the aforementioned Theodore McCarrick, former cardinal. It offers a primer, released in 2020. This report offers a primer on how church leaders countenanced McCarrick's repeated abuse of seminarians and, despite multiple warnings, promoted him to the highest levels of church leadership. One word of caution had come from Mother Mary Quentin Sheridan of the Religious Sisters of Mercy of Alma, Michigan. She had learned of rumors of McCarrick's abuse during spiritual direction and reported his bad moral conduct with seminarians to the Apostolic Nuncio, the Pope's representative in the United States. The nuncio brushed off Sheridan's concern, attributing them to, quote, possible slander or exaggeration, and suggested that she had simply disclosed this information out of a desire to make herself appear important. This dismissal, like Mulkerrin's entire experience in the Boston Chancery, highlights the interlocking hierarchies that created the Catholic clergy sex abuse crisis. Adults over children, yes, but also hierarchy over clergy and clergy over laity, which means, in the Catholic tradition, men over women. Paradoxically, Sheridan and Mulkerrin belonged to a generation of Catholic women who were committed to dismantling those hierarchies. Both came of age in religious life during the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, which had been convened by Pope John Paul XXII in the spirit of aggiornamento, or updating. Vatican II changed Catholics' understanding of themselves in relationship to the Church and in terms of the societies in which they lived, which were themselves being transformed by civil rights, by feminism, and other social movements. Defining the Church as the people of God, these are the 16 documents of Vatican II. The Council de-emphasized hierarchical boundaries and highlighted the Catholic sacrament of baptism, which was universal, as opposed to that of ordination, which was reserved to a select few men. The Council mandated that members of men and women's religious communities convene a special chapter or legislative assembly to discern what the gospel called them to do in the modern world and adjust their structures and ministries accordingly. As this cartoon makes clear, U.S. Catholic sisters embrace these directives with enthusiasm. Many of them, most, loosened the strict rules that govern religious life, traded religious habits for street clothes, lived in small communities as opposed to large convents, undertook ministries other than the traditional female ones of teaching and nursing. They replaced vertical leadership structures with horizontal ones, no longer using the term Mother Superior, instead talking about a president. At the same time, Catholic sisters sought and claimed more authority within the Church itself, inspired not only by the Council, but also by U.S. feminism. On December 6, 1992, Sister Catherine Mulkerrin situated herself squarely within this era of transformation in a recorded conversation with Sister Rosenda Gill. It was part of a larger oral history project. She recalled Vatican II as a moment when the Church was calling its members to move out of entrenched ways of thinking. Her first decade as a sister had predated the Council. She had entered the congregation, she entered the CHAs in 1954. She had first met the sisters in high school, where they taught her, and she remembered that the big thing that attracted me was that they just seemed to get along so well. And also I perceived them to be very smart ladies. She entered along with 56 other women and was known as Sister Marie Martine. At 19 years old, she became a member of a community that included over 1,600 women. In her oral history, Mulkerrin spoke at length about the difficulties of her first years in the congregation. The rules at the time required that sisters' hair not only be close-cropped, as in many communities, but entirely shaved. And upon seeing herself shorn of her auburn tresses, which had been a source of vanity and pride for her since a favorite teacher had called them Titian, Mulkerrin remembered having a visceral reaction that evoked memories of the post-war punishment meted out to French women who had collaborated with Nazi occupiers. As a person who valued relationships deeply, the strict injunctions against what were called particular attachments in the convent, these were designed to foster community and also to discourage physical or sexual contact between members, left Mulkerrin feeling isolated and lonely. Like most Catholic sisters from the mid-19th through the mid-20th century, Mulkerrin supplied the labor that helped subsidize the Church's vast system of private education. From 1958 until 1966, she taught mathematics to 6th and 7th graders at St. Teresa's Parish in West Roxbury. She studied evenings and weekends at the CSJ-run Regis College, and when she graduated in 1963, her superiors informed her she'd be studying library science at Simmons College. When she asked them why she could not study literature, which she loved, she was told, "We need librarians." Through all of this, Mulkerrin recalls feeling heartened by a strong conviction that this is going to change. This will change. And when change did come, Sister Marie Martine would be at its vanguard. She reverted to her baptismal name, would now be known as Sister Catherine. And she participated in congregational conversations about how Vatican II was reimagining sisters, inviting sisters to reimagine religious life, to share it more fully with lay people. She spent the years between 1966 and 1969, this is important, at the Order Scholasticate. This is where sisters who were studying lived, recalling it as a good moment, a lively time where prominent theologians delivered lectures, where sisters debated and discussed how they were going to respond as individuals and as a community to the transformations of the Council era. In 1969, Mulkerrin was elected to the CSJ's leadership team and served on it for 15 years, the final 6 of those as president. She led the CSJs through a period she described as one of cataclysmic change, comparable in scale to the breakup of the Soviet Union, a recent event at the time the oral history was recorded. The CSJs discarded their traditional garb, reorganized leadership structures, moved to smaller residential settings, worked in places other than schools or hospitals. And as a superior, Mulkerrin was charged with listening and responding to the women who felt that they had to leave religious life, either because the changes went too far or because they felt the changes didn't go far enough. In a single year, 90 women left the congregation, and Mulkerrin met with half of them. When asked to explain their departures, she refused to give a single reason. She said 40 people had 40 different stories. She would also find herself offering counsel to a sister struggling in her ministry or with addiction, at the same time trying to manage millions of dollars for the congregation. In her words, she said, "There were moments when I might be furious and angry personally, but you've got to steer a course that you're not making enemies for the congregation." It's clear that as a leader, she had a remarkable ability to keep in mind the collective good of the congregation and see the needs of the individuals before her. She challenged sexism within the church, complaining to Boston's cardinal about the gender double standards in men and women's communities. When the cardinal, Bernard Law, created a task force designed to restructure the archdiocese to foster lay leadership, he invited Mulkerrin to join, a step she saw as a path to a more inclusive future for women in the Catholic Church. In the late 1980s, she served at a parish in a neighborhood where the aforementioned departure of many Catholic sisters had necessitated the withdrawal of sisters from the teaching staff. Committed to repairing the damage this had occasioned, Mulkerrin went out and pounded the pavement and rang doorbells in an attempt, she said, to heal bitterness and rifts. This reinforced another principle that had guided her as a leader. Openness and honesty led to reconciliation and healing. In May 1992, Cardinal Law again approached Mulkerrin with an opportunity to lead at the archdiocesan level. A recent lawsuit in a neighboring diocese of Fall River had precipitated many victims of sexual abuse, clergy sexual abuse in Boston coming forward. At that point, allegations of sexual misconduct were referred to the Archdiocesan Office of Ministerial Personnel. When the cardinal offered Sister Catherine a position in the same office, he explained that the priest in charge, a priest named John McCormick, could no longer handle the volume on his own. So many victims were coming forward. So Mulkerrin accepted and began her post that summer. By the time she spoke with Sister Rosenda, she had been in the position for about 4 months. Sister Rosenda characterized Mulkerrin's job as being, quote, on the cutting edge of the church in America. Mulkerrin was more circumspect. She explained that she was helping the Archdiocese to create a policy and establish a review board of lay advisors, and that she spoke on the telephone or in person with people who wished to make an allegation against a priest. She explained that her task was to listen to adults who had been abused as children or teenagers, help them find therapy, and arrange for the Archdiocese to pay for it. When the new policy in Boston was announced in January 1993, as well as a lay advisory board comprised of clergy, doctors, psychologists, and lay people, Mulkerrin was quoted in the diocesan newspaper as explaining that this was a step in helping the church, quote, move beyond embarrassment, fear, or shame when dealing with reports of sexual abuse. The new policy and her own office provided Catholics, she said, with an opportunity to search for the truth. Exhorting the whole church to walk together, she observed that we can talk about these situations and then we can be involved in addressing them. So for the second time in her religious life, Mulkerrin is sensing massive change on the horizon. She has no illusions about how difficult and even how traumatic affecting that change would be. But she has great faith in the Catholic Church and in herself. It had survived an earlier period of tumult, and in Mulkerrin's view, the church had emerged stronger, more inclusive, and better prepared to respond to the call of the gospel in the modern world. She had effectively shepherded her own congregation through a period of upheaval, and having become herself one of the very smart ladies she had so admired in high school, Mulkerrin approached her new job with a confidence that she would guide it through another one. It's therefore illustrative to juxtapose Mulkerrin's oral history with another account she gave of herself almost exactly 10 years later, on December 9th, 2002, her 67th birthday, when she was summoned to the law office of Roderick MacLeish to be deposed in the case of Gregory E. Ford et al. Versus Cardinal Bernard Law. 11 months had passed since the Spotlight investigative team published its first story on sex abuse in Boston. The main plaintiff had been abused by Reverend Paul Shanley between 1983 and 1989 when he was between the ages of 6 and 12. The case against the cardinal rested on his failure to act against Shanley and other abusive priests and for allowing them to continue in ministry. Discovery in the Ford case obtained more than 300,000 pages of documents related to more than 140 Boston priests. The transcript of Mulkerrin's deposition runs to 571 pages. I'm going to use a single one of them as a springboard into to explore her multi-layered entanglement in sex abuse in Boston. On page 94, the record shows that MacLeish asked Mulkerrin if she had ever heard of allegations of women being raped by priests during her time working in Boston. He prompts her, "Remember Father Thomas Forey, I'm sorry, Father Meffin." I have that underlined in green. "Yes," she says. MacLeish moves on. Now, Mulkerrin, of course, would have been prepared by her own legal counsel not to reveal more than was strictly necessary in her responses. And yet her one-word answer is powerfully suggestive. Writing about clerical sexual abuse requires the historian to probe the multiple silences embedded in the sources. In this case, it is only through an examination of Mulkerrin's subsequent testimony, press coverage, deposition exhibits, and supplemental archival repositories that it is possible to reveal the volumes that her simple yes left unsaid, starting with the fact that Robert Meffin was a name she would have been particularly unlikely to forget. Ordained in 1953, Robert Meffin stands out, even among a pantheon of priest perpetrators, as especially repulsive. Under the guise of spiritual direction, he initiated sexual acts with teenage girls, encouraging them to believe they were making love to Jesus Christ himself. In at least 3 documented cases, there are many more, Meffin persuaded his victims to enter convents where he continued to abuse them as they prepared to take formal vows. One of Meffin's survivors testified he told her that the image of Christ and his church's bridegroom and bride was not metaphorical but literal. This is from an excerpt from an article that was published on December 4th, 2002, just 2 weeks before Mulkerrin was deposed. Church leaders, unlike the public, knew of the problems with Meffin's ministry since 1976. Allegations of sexual misconduct surfaced then, and in 1984, Meffin informed the Archdiocese that he could not accept any regular assignment because, quote, he was occupied with a mission confided to him by God, which he is bound to keep secret. That alone convinced Boston's auxiliary bishop, Bishop John Darcy, to recommend to Cardinal Law that Meffin not be reassigned. Darcy had also cautioned Law against appointing Reverend John Gagan, who had a history of homosexual activity with young boys, as pastor of a parish in Weston, Massachusetts. Cardinal Law ignored Darcy's advice in Meffin's case and that of Thomas Forey, a priest who had physically abused his housekeeper, and the perpetrator MacLeish had initially confused for Meffin. As for Darcy, he was soon appointed to become bishop of the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. And I can tell you, as a resident of that diocese, that is not a plum position in the hierarchy. He was clearly transferred as punishment for what was perceived as his outspokenness. In 1986, a former Sister of St. Joseph, a member of Mulkerrin's community, approached the Archdiocese alleging that Meffin had sexually abused her for more than 12 years. She was interviewed by an auxiliary bishop who informed Meffin of the allegations, which he denied. The matter would rest for another 7 years until another former CSJ alerted the Archdiocese to Meffin's history. This time, the person charged with responding was Sister Catherine Mulkerrin. Now, as we have seen, Mulkerrin volunteered only the bare minimum when asked if she remembered Meffin. But when we piece together the story with other sources, we learn that in January 1993, 6 weeks after she'd been interviewed by Sister Rosenda, Mulkerrin had received a call in her office from J.M., a former CSJ who was by then a practicing psychologist. J.M. reported that she had seen Meffin on a Catholic television show. Distraught and sickened, J.M. told Sister Catherine that she knew of at least 3 Sisters of St. Joseph who had been abused by Meffin during her own time in the community 25 years earlier. Now, one can only wonder what went through Mulkerrin's mind during that phone call as the sexual abuse crisis came home to her in a personal way through a victim in her own community. What can be verified is what she did next. She followed standard operating procedure. She, upon learning of an allegation, searched a file drawer which contained records of previous accusations, including those that predated her own arrival. She discovered the 1986 charge and learned that there had been no adverse consequences for Meffin. And as was her practice, Mulkerrin reached out to this woman. Her name has been redacted from legal files, but it is easily discovered through other sources, making it, and I'm not going to disclose it, but it is possible to verify that she had entered the CSJs in 1965 and withdrew in 1976. It's unclear how well Mulkerrin would have known this woman or the other 2 CSJs personally. But even if she had not known them, it's hardly conjecture to posit that hearing their stories was heart-wrenching and, given the timing, guilt-inducing. The abuse had taken place on her own watch, so to speak, during her years in leadership. Meffin's case, like that of Thomas Forey, offers a corrective to most studies and media accounts of clergy sexual abuse, which overwhelmingly focus on male victims. Abuse of women and girls is likely underreported, perhaps because of a misogynistic presumption that men's stories matter more. It is also very likely grossly underestimated, perhaps because, as my colleague Marie Griffith has posited, sexual abuse of girls is more normalized in Catholic culture. Mulkerrin's experience illuminates what Griffith calls Catholic women's holy subservience from another angle. In the passage from the Ford deposition that comes immediately after that first Meffin reference, McLeish read aloud an excerpt from a memo from Mulkerrin to McCormick, the priest in charge of her office, dated May 18th, 1994. You can read it there, but here is the memo, the original memo, and this is an example of the kind of documents you can access on bishop accountability. CEM, that's Catherine Elizabeth Mulkerrin. This may be by the books, but it feels like a second victimization. The burden is put on a minor all over again and now on his family. Broken record by CEM. It has come to our attention that a priest stationed here between 19 blank and 19 blank may have molested children. Please contact ... parish bulletin. What she's referring to here is another protocol she developed, which was to review an accused priest assignment card, primarily to check if he was still in active ministry. But the card also revealed all his previous assignments, and Mulkerrin suggested that upon hearing credible allegations, the Archdiocese publish brief notes in the weekly bulletins of all the parishes in which he had worked. Listing the dates of the priest's service, explained that he'd been accused of sexual misconduct, and invite parishioners who had any relevant information to come forward. Her intent, she made clear, was not to garner additional evidence against the priest, but to help survivors. She had learned, through her experience in listening to victims, that having someone listen to their story offered them a measure of comfort and perhaps a way to healing. She believed that these notices in parish bulletins would encourage those who had, quote, kept their secret for years to come forward so that they might be freed. In October of 1993, Mulkerrin did alert the pastor at St. Teresa's in Roxbury, where she had taught, of an allegation against a priest, and one notice did subsequently appear in the church bulletin. This appears to have been an isolated incident, perhaps attributable to her own personal connection at St. Teresa's. Mulkerrin was clearly frustrated that her recommendations had not been widely adopted. Pressed to elaborate on her word choice in her May 1994 memo, she uses gendered language. I wrote broken record. Any woman saying anything 2 or 3 times or whatever times is a broken record. The deposition also reveals the gender dynamics shaped her job description. When Cardinal Law offered it to her, the position was presented to her as originating in a need for a division of labor precipitated by victim overload. In fact, it functioned as a differentiation of labor. Mulkerrin would meet with the victims and report to McCormick, who would in turn communicate with the accused priests. In her deposition, she recalled that she had always felt very free to say exactly what I was thinking to McCormick, but was less certain, even at the time, that he had listened. She later admitted that McCormick had always seemed to have more of a feel for priests than victims. There's ample evidence to confirm her hunch. Consider the note McCormick sent to Robert Meffin in April of 1993. "I realize," he wrote, "it is not easy to have such allegations made about you, Bob. I sense they are very upsetting." I could go on and on about the role that clerical cronyism played in McCormick's interactions with the accused priests in Boston. It was on particularly vivid display in another case that Mulkerrin was queried about extensively in the Ford deposition, the case of Joseph Birmingham. When the father of boys who had reported abuse by Birmingham confronted the Archdiocese, he was transferred to another parish that had an elementary school of 600 children. Also serving at this parish was McCormick, who had been Birmingham's seminary classmate. At least one of Birmingham's survivors reported that he routinely saw McCormick in the rectory while he was on the way to Birmingham's room, where he was forced to engage in mutual masturbation with the priests. McCormick did nothing. This is an excerpt of a response that in which he's writing to the father of an altar boy and said that there's absolutely no factual basis. Birmingham died in 1989, but a number of his victims came forward when Sister Catherine worked in McCormick's office. During her deposition, she admitted that she learned of McCormick's relationship with Birmingham from the Boston Globe, and that she could not recall him disclosing that key information to her, that they'd been seminary classmates and that they were assigned together once during the months they worked on the Birmingham case. A gender differentiation of labor is also evident in the operations of the review board. Mulkerrin attended all meetings of this board, but as she later put it, without voice. She had never been invited to present and never consulted in advance of the meetings by McCormick, who presided over them. This was remarkable given that she had a better and more integrated knowledge of clerical sexual abuse than anyone in the Archdiocese. Review board members never learned the names of the accused and never saw documentation. Mulkerrin not only knew the name of the priest, but his entire assignment history and the number of previous allegations against him. And while McCormick never met with victims, Mulkerrin conducted interviews with over 200 of them. Her extensive handwritten notes show that she recorded acts of sexual violence unflinchingly. Her follow-up correspondence with survivors demonstrate how pained she was by their testimony. She often expressed gratitude to them for their courage, writing to one that she was in awe of your honesty and your capacity and will to journey through years of suffering. For their part, many survivors were grateful to McCormick for listening to them. This is an example of one writing to her, explaining how this person saw her service to them. Another survivor remembered that the most difficult part of the process was giving the graphic details of what happened. And as a result, she found it easier to disclose those details to a woman, a non-male authority figure. Conducting interviews with survivors, following up with them, attending the meetings of the review board, mapping the assignment history of accused priests, the scale of Mulkerrin's efforts later impressed even the attorneys who deposed her. McLeish treated her more gingerly than he did other witnesses. He had a degree of respect and even admiration for her. At one point he said, "Let's talk about what you tried to do here, sister," which was a lot. But he also prevailed upon Mulkerrin to concede that there were many things she did not do. She did not verify that the psychologist on the review board had expertise in abuse. He did not. He was a forensic psychologist. She never went to the police. She did not communicate to anyone apart from McCormick the scope and magnitude of the abuse. She did not ascertain that Cardinal Law knew what she knew. As she explained to the prosecutor, she had, quote, assumed this would be communicated. She understood herself to be a conduit, and she trusted that the system would work. The hierarchical and patriarchal firewall around Mulkerrin was so firmly in place that she actually had very little interaction with Cardinal Law during her time at the Chancery. She saw him on a handful of occasions in 2 years, and that counts the time she had requested an appointment to tender her resignation. Even on that occasion, the Cardinal's secretary apparently forgot to record it on his schedule, and as he was on his way out of the country, he breezed through it. Mulkerrin had 10 minutes with the cardinal, during which she told him that she was no longer spiritually, psychologically, or physically capable of doing the work required of her. She is more forthright 8 years after the fact in the deposition. She characterizes herself as traumatized and describes her experience as a nightmare. She officially left the Office of Ministerial Personnel in September 1994. Her responses in the deposition point to the ways that her experience in this office must have compelled her to revisit several aspects of the story she'd recounted to Sister Rosenda in her oral history. Elaborating on what listening to victims had cost her personally, she told attorneys that because she considered their desire for confidentiality to be sacred, she had found it to be very difficult to be pastorally present to victims without having anyone else to share in. She actually lived, for the time she worked at the Chancery, she lived at the Community's Retreat Center, a 50-minute commute away, even though she could have lived in the convent right in Brighton. And there's no stated reason for this choice, but the assumption is that she secluded herself because of the nature of her work. So here she is, experiencing isolation again in religious life. Were Mulkerrin's fond recollections of teaching in St. Teresa's tainted by learning that 3 students had been abused by 2 parish priests during her tenure there, including one young boy in her math class, who she later interviewed? Did it torture her to realize that while she was hosting prominent theologians at the CSJ Scholasticate, exhilarated and inspired by the transformations of Vatican II, the novices living just across the road were being sexually violated by Robert Meffin? Would she have viewed her service on the Archdiocesan Task Force as a sign that the Church would indeed elevate lay and women's leadership? And finally, how long did she work in the Office of Ministerial Personnel before she realized that the principles that had guided her through 15 years of leadership in the CSJ no longer applied? By the time she resigned, it would have been hard for her to trust that openness led to progress, or to maintain any sense of balance between the needs of individuals and the community. Any faith she had in herself as in a leader must have been seriously eroded. She had been an authority figure in name only, a leader who exercised little influence and wielded no power. Sister Catherine understood her departure from the Chancery as a failure she accepted as uniquely her own. And in doing this, she was replicating the practice of many insiders within the Catholic Church, who in seeking to explain sexual abuse, privilege personalities over patterns, and blame human weakness instead of structural defects. A historical analysis, by contrast, shifts a great deal of the culpability to gender hierarchies within the Church, which severely circumscribe the ability of women, even courageous, intelligent, and experienced women who had ostensible positions of authority, to make any kind of difference. Now, we cannot know the extent to which Mulkerrin's experience prompted her to rethink her personal trajectory as a sister. She didn't do another oral history. What we can do is ask how her story challenges a narrative that historians have crafted about women like her. If Mulkerrin's first 40 years in the community tell one story about Catholic sisters' experience in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, her final 14 years in the community tell precisely the opposite story. Read by itself, that 1992 oral history presents the post-Vatican II period as an era of openness, empowerment, autonomy, and leadership for Catholic sisters. Read in concert with the Ford deposition, that narrative becomes impossible to support. So here's an example of we take Spotlight and shine it on other narratives, and how do they change? I just want to mention a few other narratives which I think are poised to be upended under Spotlight's glare. Just Meffin's case alone. I remember the first time I taught about anti-Catholicism in the antebellum era in my Catholics in America class after I had read the extensive Meffin file. This is a document, an 1854 treatise, Popery Unmasked. It's one of a genre of similarly themed books, pamphlets, and cartoons that were sensational, chronicling sexual crimes that allegedly occurred in Catholic spaces, such as confessionals and convents. Historian Richard Hofstadter, who memorably dubbed these publications the pornography of the Puritan, interpreted them primarily as manifestations of the anti-Catholic animus that pervaded antebellum America. But what I'm saying is that it's impossible now to think of these only as anti-Catholic tropes. In the case of Meffin and others, lurid Protestant fantasies give way to grim Catholic realities. I want to be very careful here because I'm attentive to the work of a historian and realizing, to quote Brian Kleitz again, and actually Catherine quotes him in her most recent article on this. It is important that these studies be rigorously grounded in the specificities of historical time and place. I don't want to play fast and loose with chronology and suggest a through line between this kind of literature and Robert Meffin. But I am saying that it is important to read, to acquire this familiarity with the documents so that they can be in conversation with each other. Another one, just as Meffin's misdeeds should prompt historians to revisit the roots of religious prejudice against U.S. Catholics, another part of his file disrupts another aspect of, kind of a now standard aspect of their collective triumph over it. When Meffin's behavior had first attracted the attention of church leaders, Meffin had defended himself by complaining that the Archdiocese of Boston needed more priests like those in Going My Way. Everyone loved them, and they did priestly work, cooperating together, old and young. Meffin had conjured his ideal priest from a 1942 film starring Bing Crosby as Father O'Malley, a dynamic and caring young priest who, in contrast to the elderly curmudgeon who serves as the pastor, befriends and wins over the young boys of the neighborhood. Again, it's impossible to show this movie, and Tracy and I have a book we worked on together, Catholics in the Movies, that talked about Going My Way as one sign of Catholics' arrival in, and it is that, it still is that, but it's impossible to watch Going My Way again without perceiving Father O'Malley as a creep, as someone who relied on his affability and proximity to young people and his elevated status to cultivate victims. Robert Meffin was placed on leave in July of 1993 and granted senior priest retirement status in 1996. On that occasion, Cardinal Law wrote to thank him in my name and in the name of the people of the Archdiocese for the ministry which you have offered in both hospital and parish settings over the years since your ordination in 1953. He went on in this vein for a paragraph, concluding that the lives and hearts of many people have been touched by your sharing of the Lord's Spirit. In response, Meffin wrote a life story in which he characterized himself, are you ready? A prisoner of love in a cell of allegation. In turn, Law praised the depth of his faith and the courage of your heart. You have touched me deeply, Bob. This is the man that couldn't give 10 minutes to Catherine Mulkerrin. Meffin finally admitted his abuse in 2002 and was laicized in 2004. Appointed Bishop of Manchester, New Hampshire in 1998, John McCormick managed to fend off calls for his resignation once his complicity in the Boston scandal was revealed. Cardinal Law did not. Under intense scrutiny, Law resigned as Archbishop of Boston on December 12, 2002, just 1 week after Mulkerrin was deposed in the Ford case. He left Boston having been offered a place to live by none other than Mother Quentin Sheridan, the Sister of Mercy who had warned the Apostolic Nuncio about the abusive tendencies of Theodore McCarrick. Sheridan's warning had come in April 1994, 1 month before Mulkerrin's broken record memo. But the women had followed different paths. Sheridan's motive in reporting allegations at McCarrick had been primarily to avoid scandal. Mulkerrin had cared far more about healing victims than she had about protecting the church, and she paid a price for that. Writing to another member of her community in 2007, Mulkerrin wryly referred to our current Roman resident after reading Ambition and Arrogance, a biography about one of Law's predecessors. History repeats itself, or at least many echoes. How sad. Mulkerrin had spent the intervening years working as a parish minister in Scranton, Pennsylvania from 1994 to 1998, when she returned to Boston and worked as a spiritual director until she died in 2008. Those who would cite the bad apples argument to absolve the church of blame for clerical sexual abuse forget the second half of the aphorism. One rotten apple spoils the whole barrel. The contaminant of clergy sexual abuse, the more I read the sources, I believe that it reaches into every corner of the church, and as such, is no longer possible to be a credible historian of the Catholic Church without at least asking how the sources on it cast themes and topics in a new light. I've focused on the history of Catholic sisters in the 20th century, the legacy of Vatican II reforms, suggested glancingly that we need to look at antebellum, anti-Catholicism, U.S. Catholic success. But my prediction is that scholars can and will add any number of topics to this. The list, I fear, is endless. Thank you. take a question? Okay.
We have time for questions. So I would ask you to, because we are recording this, I would ask you to wait until we hand you the mic before you start your question. Otherwise, you won't. Your voice will not show up on the recording. Yes.
Thank you for that interesting talk. Do you have any idea about the people who in the United States who identified as Catholic in 2000 compared to, let's say, 20 years later?
There have been studies. The Pew Foundation has done some studies, and I don't have the exact statistics at the top of my head, but there are fewer. Just anecdotally too, I know this has had a dramatic effect.
And some of it possibly related to all of this. I know in my family it's related to all of this.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Many people I know. Many people personally, even before I started writing about this, who just can't. That what they learned, they can't continue. Yeah.
Thank you. Don't you think that these transgressions by the clergy is inherent in the job that they have selected? That maybe people who are broken and damaged are attracted to these professions, where they are secluded and in institutions that protect them, and where they're only surrounded by people of their own sex?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think that inherently. I think it is. Listen, I'm not going to talk about all the good priests. That one statistic, which is probably lower than it actually is 5.9% of priests in active ministry. That means that there are others who are not. I do think that there's an element of truth to what you're suggesting, and I think that in response to this, so for example, Bishop Darcy, the guy who was transferred, I mean, when he came to the Diocese of Fort Wayne South Bend, he really he had learned in Boston, and he improved seminary formation, and who he admitted to the seminary, tried to make seminarians less isolated. So I think there are ways to mitigate this. I don't think it's inherent, but I do think that that the Catholic Church the structures of the Catholic Church haven't found. I mean, there are broken people in every profession, right? And whenever adults have access to children, there is abuse.
But particular sublimation in clergy of the Catholic Church, because they're not allowed to marry.
Well, but what about all this colleague I mentioned, Marie Griffith, who was part of our Gender, Sex, and Power project? She is actually doing a comparative study of clerical sexual abuse in the Catholic Church and in the Southern Baptist Church, and she's finding the same things. Yeah. It's actually not because they're not allowed to marry. It's everywhere, and I mean I'm not an expert on the Southern Baptist thing, but the more I'm learning about other transitions, there are uniquely Catholic aspects to this. The sacramental, the use of confession. I mean, there are absolutely uniquely Catholic things to this, but so much of it is not uniquely Catholic. So much of it is unfortunately ubiquitous.
Hi, I'm particularly interested in the Satanic Panic, so 1980s through 90s, and the book Michelle Remembers was a huge impact on the Satanic Panic, and it was largely a woman who said that she was sort of was having these memories of being abused, but Catholicism was used as a way to exorcise demons and that sort of stuff later on in culture and The Exorcist and all that kind of stuff. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that because this is such a long history of abuse that's happened in the Catholic Church, that there's this sort of perverse switch between like just like the secrecy of what's going on underneath the surface in the church, but then it also being like this turn into blaming it on like Satanists and cult leaders and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't the most recent quote from Pope Francis on this, when I said he also cites the bad apples theory, he doesn't use that language, but he talks about, he's declared zero tolerance for sex abuse, but describes it as something that is diabolical. And again, I think you mentioned secrecy. I think this would be another layer of something that is part of what's Catholic about the Catholic sexual abuse crisis, that the culture is secrecy. Confession it is one thing, is absolutely adding another layer. I also think the history of Catholics in the United States, Catholics, Catherine O'Donnell just wrote an article about this in the early Republic, at a time when Catholics were being challenged as American citizens. The violations of clerical celibacy were shameful, but they didn't want him getting out to the broader community because it would just affirm that. So yes, I think I can't speak directly to satanic panic, but that gives me something to think about, and I think secrecy is definitely a layer here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's caused me to think about looking at this issue through the lens of organizational behavior. And if I look at outside organizations, you can look at the military, the police, banking, manufacturing, and see the similar phenomena happening where something goes wrong, the organization closes ranks. Any whistleblowers tend to be persecuted, even though we have laws to protect them and so on. Do you not look forward with despair?
No, I absolutely do. There's so much about that. And I mean, I've been thinking much more about the church as an organization. I mean, you know, a lot of what I didn't want to write about the priests and the bishops, right? I started as a historian. I wanted to write about the women and the faith lives, and you know, and you know, we do lived religion. That's our thing, you know. But I now have come to believe, and this book that somebody held up, my most recent book, I wrote about saints. I wrote about American saints, and I wanted to write about how people believed in the saints and what that belief told us about the way Catholics understood themselves as Americans. And I did write about that. But I also I didn't want to write about the canonization process, right? Because that was ecclesial. That was tedious. So I just wanted to write about all this fun stuff. And in the end, I wrote about both. And because you ignore the institution at your peril. You can't ignore the institution of the Catholic Church if you write about the Constitution, if you write about the Catholic Church. And I think, too, in terms of organizational culture, I mean, what I'm learning, one of my colleagues who is in the business school co-chaired a task force with me on responding to the sex abuse crisis as scholars. And I learned from her about organizational culture, where it's well known that organizations make bad decisions when they don't have diversity, that when they're all the same, that the more diversity you have, the more likely you are to make better decisions. And the Catholic Church does not have a lot of diversity. I mean, it has, in terms of gender diversity, it has none. So yes, absolutely. So do I despair? Yeah, I think it's because it is endless. I mean, I could write only about this for, you know, I mean, imagine writing a book on saints and then writing a book about this, but it's important to do. So no, I guess I don't completely have despair. No, not yet.
Thank you for. I'm inspired by the method you're using. I think it's very promising. You know.
Thank you.
Because, but at any rate, I had a colleague who is an ordained Methodist pastor, but he's a clinical psychologist. And he has a number of patients who are Catholic priests. Most are perpetrators. And he called me and he asked me this question. He said, as a Methodist, we have bishops and they give us orders and, you know, but he said, a Methodist bishop would never violate the conscience of a pastor. He said, what I'm seeing in my priest patients is that because their bishops have said, I don't care what your conscience says, do what I tell you, that they've lost the sense of boundary so that the boundaries which should separate them from abusing, the people who are in their pastoral care become fluid. And the alarms don't go off, because they've had that experience. I didn't have anything to say to him. I was sorry that he's not an academic and he doesn't write. But any thoughts about?
Well, I have lots of questions. I mean, I know that anecdotally, I know therapists who have stopped practicing because they can't. It's nuns abused by priests that they were. It's these just horrible stories. I think in terms, and this is another Catholic layer. I think, and this covers other sins as well. But I think by and large, the vast majority of people in the Catholic Church, in the institution of the Catholic Church, prioritize the institution over the people who belong to the institution. Catherine Mulkerrin did not do that. She's a flawed figure for sure, but I think because of her listening to, she was attentive to survivors. She still couldn't see the problems with the institution, but I think by and large, the Catholic Church has been concerned with the institution. And I used to think when I first started studying this that this was rooted in the Catholic experience in the United States, but I'm starting to understand more about the global Catholic experience as well. That's a whole other, so I'm not sure about that.
So I have a question. This is really sobering work that you're doing. Thinking about two things. One is thinking about when it comes to this question of whether or not you think there's domesticating, or in this case, sanctifying rhetoric, because it's called clerical sexual abuse as opposed to violence. Mm-hmm. And when I think about the ways in which nuns are depicted, especially in popular culture, you mentioned film, I'm thinking of the 1923 spin-off of Yellowstone, mm-hmm. thinking of the Magdalene Sisters film. We tend to see nuns engaging in brutal behavior, and we see that. We don't tend to see, at least in my recollection in film, even the hint of a lascivious priest. Mm. So it's two questions. It's gendered violence within the church that gets consumed, and maybe mm-hmm. that moves the spotlight away. Mm. And I'm wondering, could there be a turn towards substituting or removing the word abuse and replacing it with violence, and whether or not that would make change?
Thank you. Yeah, I have started to substitute violence. I don't know if that's in the more in my lexicon but I think it is a more accurate term, and I'll be more conscious of that. I got started on when I talked about my turning point in August of 2018. I wrote, I was moved to write an op-ed that was published in the New York Times reacting to this very angry op-ed. And I used the word sins. And people said, why aren't you talking about crime? Yeah, so I tried to do that. It took me a while to stop to use survivors instead of victims. It's been interesting how my own lexicon is changing, and I think sexual violence is a more apt term. This is something that is I'm just starting to think about this. There are more public cases, so I wasn't able to get into the. I talked about Meffin, but there are many other cases of sisters being abused by priests, and scholars who work on. Sisters are in particularly vulnerable situations. The Mario Rupnik case. He's a Jesuit who founded a religious community in Slovenia, and he's also a very talented artist. His mosaics are just all over the world and beautiful. They're beautiful, and it's raising this interesting question of how we separate the art from the artist. But I often get questions about sisters, because that is out there about the Magdalene laundries and that kind of violence, about sisters as sexual abusers. And they're starting to be named in there are a few sisters being named in some of the diocesan reports. I'm thinking of the Maryland report that was released last spring. And I haven't done enough research on this, and I don't know, this is challenging archivally. But my sense is my hunch is that sisters who sexually abuse children, not violent toward them, but sexual violence, would have been asked to leave they would not have been certainly promoted up to Mother Superior in the way that the policing of women's sexual behavior in convents was much stricter than it was in seminaries and rectories. But I don't quite know how to put this all together yet. But it's, yeah, I mean, I've been writing about Catholic sisters for 30 years and didn't really think about this, so thank you.
Have you seen the documentary Keepers?
Yes, yeah, and part of the Facebook group that, I mean, I'm following that very avidly. Okay, there's sorry, what, Netflix? Was it on Netflix or? Yeah, but on a documentary called The Keepers, which is about the unsolved murder of a sister in Maryland, yeah, who was reportedly, or who did report a priest abuse of, and so, yeah, I mean, I follow that. I think I was intrigued. Sister Kathy Szczesnik is her name, and there's a petition for her cause for canonization to be open. Now, it's being circulated on change.org, and I got to tell you, the Vatican doesn't respond to change.org petitions very often, but this is me trying to get back to my saints book. But it's interesting because recognition of holiness begins with the people, and a similar petition in Baltimore originated to canonize 6 Black Catholic Americans. There is no Black Catholic American saint right now, and so also on change.org. So to me, I just think it's very unlikely that her cause for canonization is going to be open, but that is a way that Catholics are able to call attention to things, and so that's a sign to me that this is, people are thinking about this and talking about this. Yes.
I just had a quick question about the dioceses that have declared bankruptcy. Kind of in my view, trying to get ahead of some of this. And it could just be my own ignorance. I'd always thought like you declared bankruptcy because you didn't have the money to pay, right? Mm-hmm. But my understanding of, some of these places is they actually do have money to pay. And I wonder if you could just kind of clarify some of that. Well,
Bankruptcy law, I'm as in the dark as you are about bankruptcy law. I do think, so I guess where it means the most to me when they declare bankruptcy, I mean, I do think it's a legal strategy, but like in Boston, when Law resigned and Sean O'Malley became, he sold the mansion, he sold the bishop's mansion, and started to live a humble life. I mean, that's the kind of gestures that I think are meaningful, and too many bishops are still living as princes of the church, with vast expenditures. And yes, they do have money. Yeah, I don't know much more beyond that about. But they do have money. But the settlements are vast. What they're paying, and I think they're just beginning. I mean, I mentioned the 2002 Dallas Charter, and that did put safeguards in, and I mean, I would hope it's reduced. I mean, I sent my children to a Catholic school. Of course, there weren't many priests or nuns in the Catholic school, but sexual survivors of sexual violence, the memories don't disclose it for years. So we don't know who's being abused right now.
Right. I guess what I was trying to suggest, and it didn't come out in my question, is that it's another instance of men protecting men. I mean, it's men who preside over these. Bankruptcy.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Sorry, I thought you were asking about bankruptcy. Yeah, I mean, it's an instance of what I said in response to the gentleman back there. It's putting the institution before the people who belong to the institution.
I'm going to have to call an end to our amazing conversation. Kathy, thank you so much for this. And I'm so moved by the nature of what's going on. It seems that we know, this gets to something Curtis asked at lunch, so many of us who grew up in Catholic contexts knew all this, right? We knew it. You know, the nuns would say, look out for Father so-and-so, or everyone knew. And one of the most poignant moments, I think, in Spotlight is when Sasha Pfeiffer confronts her very, very Catholic aunt or grandma and says, you must have known this. And of course, she did know it. So on the one hand, we're doing all of this discovery, amazing discovery with very painstaking archival work. On the other hand, in another way, we're coming to terms with what so many of us know. And so there's knowing and there's knowing. And part of what you are doing, I think, is uncovering all of the ways that this knowing, we are now going to in common know and affirm. And what Sister Catherine Mulkerrin did, the woman she spoke to said she listened to me and made it possible for me to heal, to begin healing, because she listened to what we all already know. And that is just very, very powerful. So thank you so much. This is just a wonderful, wonderful occasion to say thank you all for supporting this work. Thank you, Kathy. I suspect she'll be generous enough to take a question or two over cookies, so I invite you to stay. And please join me in thanking Catherine O'Donnell for making this possible, and Kathleen Cummings again. Thank you.